October 23, 1942. Dawn broke over the Egyptian desert near Alamein. Inside the cramped hulls of their Carro Armato M1340 tanks, crews of the Ariete Armored Division checked their ammunition one final time. 104 rounds of 47mm shells per tank, 4 Breda machine guns loaded and ready. Behind them, the sound of diesel engines rumbled as 278 Italian medium tanks prepared for what would become the largest armored battle in North African history. These Italian tankers had no idea that within hours they would witness something that would shatter every assumption they held about their equipment and their chances. The Americans had arrived with a tank that would make the M13 Sotto 40, Italy's pride and most produced armored vehicle, look completely obsolete. What followed was not just a military defeat, but a shocking revelation that would transform thousands of Italian soldiers from believers in fascist propaganda into witnesses of American industrial might and power. This is the story of how Italian tank crews discovered through fire and steel that they were fighting a war with equipment hopelessly outmatched. A transformation so complete that it would change not just individual soldiers, but the fate of an entire nation forever. The seeds of this revelation were planted years before in the design rooms of Fiat Analo in the 1937. The Italian Royal Army had issued specifications for a new medium tank to replace the aging L3 Tankets and the flawed M11-39. The result was the Carro Armato M13-40, named for its scheduled weight of 13 tons and its projected introduction year of 1940. On paper, the M13-40 seemed formidable. It mounted a 47mm Predator gun in a fully rotating turret, a significant improvement over its predecessor, which had a hull-mounted gun. The armor ranged from 30mm on the frontal hull to 42mm on the turret front. 4 crew members operated the tank: a driver, machine gunner, radio operator, commander, gunner, and loader. The diesel engine, a Fiat 58 producing 125 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 32 km per hour and excellent range. Production began in late 1940 at Ansalo Facati factories, with Fiat supplying engines and Brada delivering weapons. By December 1940, monthly production reached 60 to 70 tanks. Over 700 units of the M13-40 would roll off the assembly lines before production shifted to the improved M1441 variant. In total, over 3,000 tanks would be built on this chassis or its derivatives, providing the bulk of Italian armored forces throughout the war. Italian tank commanders initially believed the M13-40 represented their entrance into modern armored warfare and were very proud of it. The 47-feeder themed 30mm gun could penetrate British cruiser tanks at normal ranges. The armor protected against British 2-pounder guns. They felt ready to fight, but these tankers were about to learn a very harsh lesson. Modern war was not static. It was a race, and Italy had already fallen behind before the first shot was fired. The first M13-40 tanks arrived in North Africa in late 1940, equipping the Babini Brigade. These crews received approximately 25 days of tank training before deployment, a fraction of what British or German crews received. Most units were hastily formed, lacking cohesion and experience. Many tanks initially lacked radios, forcing commanders to communicate through hand signals or by dismounting, a critical tactical disadvantage. The baptism of fire came in December 1940 during Operation Compass, a British offensive. At the Battle of Bardia, from January 3 to 5, 1941, Australian forces attacked Italian positions defended by M13-40 tanks. In 3 days of fighting, the Australians suffered 456 casualties. The Italians lost 40,000 men, including 2,000 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 36,000 captured. Italian tankers who survived Bardia reported the confusion. Most vehicles had no radios. When British artillery opened fire, tanks could not coordinate responses. Tanks were destroyed before they could even engage the enemy. Those that did fire found their shells effective against British light tanks, but the crews were too few, too scattered, and too unprepared. The problem was not entirely the tank itself. In early 1941, the M1340's main gun could penetrate most British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges. Its armor was comparable to opponents like the British Crusader. The design was conventional but adequate for its time. The true weakness lay in training, doctrine, and support. Italian tank crews lacked proper instruction in combined arms tactics. Recovery vehicles were virtually non-existent, meaning disabled tanks were often abandoned. Maintenance in the harsh desert environment overwhelmed undertrained mechanics. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of African coastline. By April 1941, when the German Africa Corps arrived in force, the Italians fielded approximately 240 M13 and M14 tanks in first-line service. These crews had learned hard lessons from the early defeats. Training improved. New tank training centers opened in Italy. Crews became more proficient. Radios became standard equipment. Italian tankers learned to work with German units. They could fight, and fight they did. At the First Battle of Burgaby on November 19, 1941, Italian M1340 tanks from the Ariete Division engaged British armor in a day-long battle. The engagement showed that improved Italian crews could hold their own against British Crusader tanks armed with 2-pounder 40mm guns. Both tanks were vulnerable to each other's weapons. Both had weaknesses and strengths. The battle raged across the desert as columns of smoke rose from burning vehicles. By late afternoon, British forces withdrew, leaving behind 42 to 52 destroyed Crusaders. According to various estimates, the Italians lost 34 tanks. It was a tactical victory that showed Italian tankers had come far from the confusion of Bardia. They had learned their machines. They understood fire and maneuver. Given proper training and support, they could match their opponents. During the Gazala battles in May and June 1942, Italian armor continued to prove effective in certain situations. On June 12, 1942, M1340 tanks from the Trieste Motorized Division engaged British Grant tanks in the fighting south of Knightsbridge. Multiple Allied tanks were destroyed in the engagement. Italian crews used speed and positioning to their advantage. They closed distance and fired at tracks and sides. It was desperate work, but it proved Italian tankers could fight. Yet, even as Italian crews became more skilled, the technological gap grew wider. In early 1942, the British began deploying the American-built M3 Grant medium tank in significant numbers. The Grant mounted a 75mm gun in a hull sponson and a 30-70 cm gun in the turret. Though the hull gun could only move 15 degrees, it outranged the Italian 47mm enemy weapon and could penetrate Italian armor at distances where Italian shells were ineffective. The M1340's weaknesses became more clear with each passing month. The riveted construction meant that when shells struck the armor, even without penetrating, the rivets could become deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment. The bolted hull plates often cracked under stress. The two-man turret forced the commander to act as both gunner and tactical leader, slowing reaction times. The engine, though reliable, was underpowered for the tank's weight, especially when crews added sandbags or spare track links for extra protection. Tank crews recognized these problems. Many tried to improve their vehicle's protection by piling sandbags on the glacis plate or welding extra track links to vulnerable areas. But these modifications made the already slow tanks even slower and increased breakdowns from overtaxed engines and transmissions. Italian commanders discouraged the practice, but desperate crews continued it anyway. The Italian army recognized the firepower problem. Beginning in 1942, each tank battalion included at least one company equipped with semovente 75-18 self-propelled guns. These turretless vehicles mounted a 75mm howitzer on the M1340 chassis and could fire shaped charge-high explosive anti-tank shells capable of penetrating Allied armor. They provided crucial fire support that helped offset the medium tank's weaknesses. But the 70s were not tanks. They could not engage in mobile tank combat like the M1340s, and there were never enough of them. Then came October 1942 and the Second Battle of Alamein. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army had spent months building up for a massive offensive. 3 armored divisions, including the famed Desert Rats, prepared to smash through Axis lines. The British assembled 1,000 tanks for the battle, including new Crusader Mark III tanks with powerful 6-pounder guns and Churchill infantry tanks with heavy armor. And they brought something else, something Italian tankers had heard rumors about, but never seen. American M4 Sherman medium tanks, 250 in total. 2 Shermans were operational at the start of the offensive, equipping multiple British armored brigades. This was the Sherman's combat debut in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, which included German and Italian forces, deployed approximately 540 tanks to defend. Of these, 278 were Italian M1340 and M1441 variants. Another 20 were Italian L640 light tanks. The Italian armor formed more than half of the Axis tank force. Italian tank crews took position in the southern sector of the 40-kilometer alamein line. Around them, other Italian tanks dug in behind the extensive minefields Rommel had laid, 450,000 mines twisted with barbed wire, and covered by anti-tank guns formed the Devil's Gardens that were supposed to slow the British advance. On the night of October 23rd, the Allied artillery opened fire. 900 guns hurled shells across the desert in a bombardment that shook the earth and lit the night sky. The barrage lasted for hours, a storm of high explosive and shrapnel designed to destroy, scare, and confuse. When the guns fell silent just before dawn, the infantry attack began. British and Commonwealth troops advanced through the minefields, engineers clearing paths for the tanks to follow. On the second day, the tanks came. Italian crews saw them through their commander periscopes as the sun climbed above the horizon, shapes in the distance, moving through dust and smoke, too many to count. Commanders called out ranges and targets as they had practiced many times. The main guns swiveled, tracking the approaching armor. Then they got their first clear look at a Sherman. It was bigger than expected, taller. The hull seemed to slope at angles that would deflect shells. Even over a kilometer away, crews could see the long barrel of the 75mm gun, much bigger than their own weapon. The Sherman moved with what seemed like calm confidence, not the panicked rushing of tanks under fire, but the careful advance of a predator that knew its prey was weaker. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented everything the M1340 was not. Where the Italian tank weighed 14 tons, the Sherman weighed 31 tons. The Italian tank had 30 to 42 millimeter of armor. The Sherman had 51 to 64 millimeter of frontal hull armor, heavily sloped for better deflection, and 76 millimeter on the turret front. The Italian main gun could penetrate 88 pinpointos of armor at 100 millimeters using Spanish Civil War test data, though this dropped a lot against sloped armor. Against the Sherman's sloped frontal armor, Italian shells had little chance of penetration except at very close range. The crews could only hope to hit a Sherman from the sides, rear, or by striking the tracks and suspension. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, in contrast, could penetrate 88 millimeters of vertical armor at 100 millimeters and 73 millimeter at 1,000 diameters against the M1340's thin, flat, riveted armor. These shells were deadly. The Sherman could destroy an Italian medium tank from the front at any combat range. Even worse, the Sherman was faster, more reliable, and easier to maintain. Its Continental radial engine produced 400 horsepower, more than 3 times the Italian tank's output, giving it better acceleration and cross-country performance. The 5-man crew had proper roles with a commander free from gunnery duties. Communication systems were excellent. The suspension handled rough terrain much better. Ammunition storage was better protected in every measurable way, except maybe fuel consumption. The Sherman was superior. The first fights with Sherman tanks lasted only minutes for most Italian crews. Tanks in hull-down positions, hoping to ambush Allied armor as it advanced, found that the Shermans would not cooperate. The American and British crews stopped at 1500 Malresteam, well outside the effective range of the Italian guns, and began firing. They had excellent optics and training. They took their time, picking targets carefully. Sherman shells penetrated Italian turret fronts and hulls. Tanks exploded as ammunition blew up inside. Others caught fire. When shells hit without fully penetrating, the riveted construction proved deadly. Rivets sheared off and became shrapnel inside crew compartments, killing and wounding men, even when the armor held. Italian crews ordered their drivers to reverse to get behind better cover. But the Shermans used their superior range, armor, and mobility to control the battle. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. Italian crews fought with desperate courage, trying to get close enough where their guns might work. But the Shermans stayed at a distance, used hull-down positions, and coordinated with infantry and artillery. When Italian tanks did manage to get close, often by clever use of terrain or nighttime maneuvers, they found another problem. Even hits on Sherman frontal armor often failed to penetrate. The sloped armor and hardened plates deflected shells that would have destroyed an M1340. Italian tankers were forced to aim for tracks, trying to stop their opponents, hoping that infantry anti-tank guns or German tanks could finish the job. Every fight became about survival, not winning. Crews learned to run, to hide, and to pray that they would not face the Shermans head-on. The Second Battle of Alamein raged for 13 days, from October 23rd to November 11th. Montgomery's forces broke through the Axis lines in the north, forcing a general retreat. The Ariete and Littorio armored divisions fought desperate rearguard actions, sacrificing themselves to cover the withdrawal of German forces. Tank after tank burned in the desert as Italian armor died to buy time. By November 11th, when the battle ended, the Axis forces had been decisively defeated. The Eighth Army lost about 500 tanks during the battle, but most could be repaired. The Axis lost almost all of their armored force. Of the 278 Italian medium tanks that began the battle, fewer than 30 remained operational. Escaped the battlefield. Many were simply abandoned when they broke down during the retreat, left as scrap metal in the desert. The retreat from Egypt marked the beginning of the end for Italian armor in North Africa. As the front lines moved westward, Italian tankers faced not only Shermans, but also more British Grants, improved Crusaders with 6-pounder guns, and growing numbers of American forces equipped with the latest tanks. By early 1943, the situation had become desperate. The Centauro division fighting in Tunisia was almost completely destroyed. The remaining M13 and M14 tanks were totally outclassed technologically. Their main guns were useless against Allied medium tanks except at very close range. While those same Allied tanks could destroy Italian armor from far away, Italian crews used desperate tactics. They aimed for tank tracks and suspensions instead of trying to penetrate armor. They relied heavily on supporting semovente self-propelled guns and towed artillery. They attacked at night when possible, trying to get close under cover of darkness. They used the terrain carefully, ambushing from unexpected positions. But tactics could only do so much to make up for weak equipment. The end came in May 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. About 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. Among them were the survivors of Italy's armored units, tankers who had fought from the earliest days in Libya through the terrible defeats in Egypt and Tunisia. These men entered Allied captivity with a mix of relief and shame. Relief that the fighting was over, that they had survived. Shame that Italy had been so completely defeated, that their tanks had failed, and that all their sacrifices had achieved almost nothing. But captivity would bring its own lessons. ones that would be even more psychologically shocking than the battlefield defeats. They would see industrial power that made their battlefield losses not just understandable, but unavoidable. Several thousand Italian prisoners were sent to the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 took 2 weeks aboard American Liberty ships. These ships themselves were symbols of American industrial power. The famous SS Robert E. Peary had been launched after just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes of construction at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, in November 1942. Though extra fitting out extended total delivery time, normal construction averaged 30 to 42 days by 1943. These ships, built at a rate of almost 3 per day at peak across multiple shipyards, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. The Italian prisoners noticed the abundance immediately. American sailors ate meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, white bread, and milk. The waste shocked the Italians. Sailors threw away half-eaten food, leftover bread, and extra portions. Things that would have been treasured in Italy were thrown away without thought, because the supply seemed endless. The American crew ate better than Italian officers. They complained about food quality while eating steaks and fresh fruit. They threw away in one day what Italian families would consider a month's ration. When the ships reached the American coast and docked at Norfolk, Virginia, in August 1943, the prisoners got their first look at American industrial power. The naval base stretched across thousands of acres. Dozens of ships loaded and unloaded at the same time. Electric cranes lifted cargo that would have needed gangs of laborers in Italy. The port worked 24 hours a day, lit by electric lights even at night. Former factory workers from Italian industrial cities counted dozens of cargo ships in different stages of loading. They wrote in letters home that each crane moved more material in 1 hour than Italian dock workers could handle in a day. Everything ran on electricity. Everything was mechanized. Everything was efficient on a scale that seemed impossible. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport inland. Not boxcars, but passenger coaches with padded seats. The journey from Norfolk to prison camps in the American interior took several days, passing through Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and into Texas and Oklahoma. Along the way, Italian prisoners pressed their faces against windows, seeing an America that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had told them. Every small town shone with electric lights. Shops had lit windows displaying goods. Houses had lights in many rooms. Factories ran night shifts. Their parking lots were full of worker automobiles. Automobiles, hundreds of them, thousands of them. In Italy, private car ownership was for the wealthy. Here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs. Italian officers who had traveled through Germany wrote in letters that as they passed Allied censors, they had traveled through dozens of American towns and cities. Everyone had more electric lights than Rome. They passed factories larger than anything in Milan or Turin. At midnight, they saw parking lots full of cars belonging to night shift workers. In America, workers owned cars. The trains passed near industrial facilities showing American manufacturing power. Near Louisville, the prisoners saw the synthetic rubber complex, called the Rubber Town. Multiple huge factories, each employing thousands, were part of a national program that would produce over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber each year by 1945. Louisville's facilities alone produced nearly 200,000 tons at peak production. Italy and Germany together could not match the total American output. Near Detroit, the trains slowed as they passed Ford's Willow Run bomber plant. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production in 1944. At its height, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts made by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant was visible for miles, a building so big it seemed impossible. Italian prisoners who had served in the Regia Aeronautica recognized what they were seeing. That one factory produced more aircraft in a month than all of Italy produced in a year. They had flown missions over British positions and wondered where all the planes came from. Now they knew, and the British planes were nothing compared to American production. The prison camps themselves gave the next level of revelation. Camp Hereford in Texas, one of several facilities holding Italian prisoners, had about 5,000 men in wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. The camp hospital had X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and medicine better than most civilian hospitals in Italy. The daily food ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in amounts Italian civilians had not seen since before the war. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for thousands. The 10% extra food, made to ensure everyone got full rations, was thrown away every day. Fresh bread, perfect vegetables, extra meat, all thrown away because American rules required plenty. Former Italian chefs working in camp kitchens wrote to their families in anguish. They threw away more food each day than their entire villages had seen in months. Not spoiled food, fresh bread, good vegetables, meat without defects. The Americans required extra to make sure no one went hungry. They had so much that waste was policy, not failure. By autumn 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to Italian prisoners working in fields and factories under Geneva Convention rules. They could not work directly on war production, but they could work in industries that freed American workers for military service. This meant Italian tankers, men who had fought American forces in the desert, now saw American productive power firsthand. At farms in Nebraska, Italian prisoners worked in wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. A single combine harvester did the work of 100 men using traditional methods. Yields reached 60 bushels per acre, double what Italian farms produced on their best land. The farmers spoke casually of production that would have been impossible in Italy. At cotton processing facilities in Texas, former tankers watched single electric-powered gins process more cotton in 1 hour than their entire home regions could handle in a month, using traditional labor. The facilities were part of rural electrification programs that were spreading quickly across America, transforming farm productivity. Prisoners noticed that the farmers who owned these facilities were not aristocrats, not rich elites, just normal farmers. Yet they had electricity, running water, trucks, cars, and tractors. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, Italian prisoners watched automated production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most Italian canning facilities handled in a month. One elderly woman monitored controls that would have required 50 workers in Italy. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee on break. The factory ran with a small crew because most young workers were in military service. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Italian tankers working at military supply depots helped unload equipment and gained insight into American logistics. They saw warehouses full of spare parts for tanks, trucks, and aircraft. They watched trains arrive daily with artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and replacement engines. The abundance was shocking. They had wondered in Africa why the Americans and British never seemed to run out of supplies. Now they understood. The Americans did not just have supply lines. They had supply rivers, supply oceans. They produced so much that shortage was impossible. The transformation of Italian prisoners continued through late 1943 and into 1944. The cumulative evidence, the daily observations, the undeniable facts of American industrial power broke down the propaganda they had been fed for years. They had been told that democracies were weak, that Italy's fascist system was more efficient, and that American society was in decline. Everything they saw proved the opposite. Italian officers attended educational courses offered at the camps. American universities provided correspondence programs. Professors lectured on democracy, economics, and the Constitution. Government. The lectures were not propaganda in a crude sense. They were logical arguments backed by things prisoners could see for themselves. Officers wrote to their families that they had been told democracies could not match Axis production because they valued profit over national service. Yet, American factories, run by private companies, produced more tanks than all Axis nations combined. They had been told that worker exploitation was necessary for military strength. Yet American workers, paid good wages and allowed to join unions, built better weapons faster than Italian workers under strict control. Every assumption they had been taught was proven false by what they saw with their own eyes. The Battle of Normandy in June 1944 brought news that 6,000 Allied ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave had landed in France. Italian prisoners at camps across America watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, and the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons of material every day across open beaches. Officers watching the newsreels turned to their fellow prisoners and admitted what had become obvious. Italy had challenged this industrial power with Fiat trucks and M13 tanks that broke down in the desert. They had been mad. They had been criminally, stupidly mad to think they could win. Throughout their captivity, Italian prisoners experienced something unexpected: American humanity. Despite propaganda that said Americans were ruthless and vengeful, prisoners discovered people who separated Italian soldiers from the fascist regime. American guards explained that they were fighting Mussolini and Hitler, not the Italian or German people. When prisoners received Red Cross messages about family deaths in Allied bombing raids, American camp commanders personally delivered the news and offered sympathy. When prisoners' families fell ill in Italy, American church groups helped send medicine through neutral channels. These small acts of kindness, repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps, challenged the prisoners' understanding of their enemies. The medical care particularly affected Italian tankers who had been wounded before capture. Tank injuries were often severe: burns, shrapnel wounds, and crushing trauma. American military hospitals provided care that was better than what German or Italian facilities could offer. Penicillin, the miracle drug, penicillin, was used freely, even on prisoners. Italian medical officers who worked in camp hospitals later said they used advanced medicine without hesitation on enemy prisoners. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in Italian hospitals recovered because Americans gave them penicillin. After Italy's armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, about 90% of Italian prisoners, around 45,000 men, agreed to cooperate with the Allied war effort. These men were organized into Italian service units and given better living quarters, American uniforms with insignia, more freedoms, and chances to meet Italian-American communities. They worked in ports, supply depots, and support roles, freeing American soldiers to fight. The remaining 10%, who stayed loyal to fascism, were separated into facilities like Camp Hereford, where they received standard prisoner treatment under Geneva Convention rules. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Italian prisoners faced return home with mixed feelings. Many had been in America for 2 years. They had eaten better as prisoners than they did as soldiers. They had been treated with dignity by enemies who had defeated them. They had seen a society that worked, produced plenty, and proved that democracy could function. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for their return. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political lessons about democratic government. Prisoners learned about economic systems, constitutional rights, and civic participation. They were being prepared not to return as defeated soldiers, but as citizens of a new democratic Italy. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of Italian prisoners went back to Italy. The country they found was destroyed, cities bombed, infrastructure ruined, and the economy collapsed. The fascist government that had sent them to war was gone, replaced by weak democratic institutions. But these returning prisoners brought something valuable: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society worked. They had seen efficiency without tyranny. They had seen prosperity without conquest. They had learned that strength came from freedom, not control. The Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps and on American Marshall Plan aid. Former prisoners brought American methods to Italian industry. They used agricultural techniques learned on American farms. They supported democratic institutions because they had seen democracy work. Historians who have studied the Italian prisoner of war experience in America note several remarkable statistics. Of the tens of thousands of Italian prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1% tried to escape. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands kept writing to American families for decades after the war. Many immigrated to America in the 1950s and 1960s. The technical details tell part of the story. The M1340 weighed 14 tons with 30 to 42 mm armor and a 47-10 cm gun. The Sherman weighed 31 tons with 51 to 64 mm threats of frontal hull armor, heavily sloped, and 76 mm on the turret front. The Sherman's engine produced 400 horsepower compared to the M13's 125. Both guns could penetrate about 73 to 88 beam of vertical armor at 1,000 meters, but the Sherman's sloped armor made it act much thicker. But the deeper story is about systems, not just machines. Italy made about 3,000 tanks on the M1340 chassis and its versions during the whole war. America made over 49,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946. American industry built tanks faster than they could be destroyed. Italian industry could not replace losses. The M1340 needed skilled craftsmen to build. Production rates rarely went over 70 tanks per month. The Sherman was built for mass production from the start. At peak production, American factories delivered over 2,000 Shermans per month. One factory alone made more tanks than Italy produced in an entire year. This production capacity was repeated across every type of military equipment: aircraft, trucks, artillery, ammunition, all produced in amounts Italy could not match. The Italian tankers who fought Shermans at El Alamein were not defeated by better soldiers or superior tactics, though both mattered. They were defeated by an economic system that could fight total war on a global scale. Historians who studied Italian armor in World War II have said that the M1340 was not a terrible tank by 1940 standards. It was okay for its time. The problem was that by 1942 it was old, and Italy did not have the industry to make a better tank in large numbers. Italian tankers fought bravely with outdated equipment against enemies with superior machines. Their defeat was certain not because of cowardice or mistakes, but because of math. The story of Italian tankers facing Sherman tanks is really a story about industrial power deciding military outcomes. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome a 3.1 disadvantage in numbers combined with a technological gap that made each Sherman tank stronger than each M1340 in almost every way. But it is also a story about change. The Italian prisoners who saw American industrial power did not just learn that they had been outmatched. They learned why. They saw an economic and political system that produced abundance through freedom, not scarcity through control. They returned to Italy as supporters of democracy, helping build a country that would become one of America's closest allies. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci of the Ariete Division showed the courage of Italian tankers even with impossible odds. On November 4th to 5th, 1942, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, Pascucci commanded 11 M1340 tanks in a last counterattack against the British 8th Armored Brigade. His actions allowed the Ariete Division to retreat. Though Pascucci was killed in the fighting, he was posthumously awarded Italy's highest military honor, the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare. Today, the Italian Army's 13th Tank Battalion carries his name, M.O. Pascucci, to honor his sacrifice. General Francesco Antonio Arena commanded the Ariete Division during its final battle at El Alamein on November 4, 1942. As his division was surrounded and destroyed, Arena sent a famous last message that showed both the desperate situation and the determination of Italian armor. Enemy tanks broke through south of the Ariete Division. Thus, Ariete was surrounded. Located 5 kilometers northwest of Bir al-Abdi, Ariete tanks were still fighting. The division earned its gold medal of military valor for bravery in many battles at Tobruk, Bardia, Gubi, Gazala, Alam el-Halfa, and El Alamein. British and New Zealand reports recognized the skill of Italian armored units when properly equipped and led. The Ariete Division, despite old equipment and early training problems, showed it could fight strongly. British historian John Latimer said that Italian soldiers were tough and hardy and, many times, fought as bravely as any soldiers in the world. The Fulgor Paratrooper Division sent 5,000 men to El Alamein, with only 304 surviving, fighting until they used all their ammunition. The change was complete. Italian tankers had gone to war believing in fascist power. They met Sherman tanks and found their equipment hopelessly weaker. They became prisoners and saw the industrial system that made their defeat certain. They went home as supporters of the democratic capitalism that had beaten them, helping build a new Italy allied with the nation that had destroyed their tanks in the desert. In the end, America's victory over Italian armor was not just military. It was ideological, economic, and total. The M1340 crews who fought at El Alamein left the battlefield defeated. But those who saw American captivity came back changed, bringing seeds of democracy to Italy that helped create the free and prosperous nation that exists today. The rumble of diesel engines in the Egyptian desert that October morning in 1942 marked not just the start of a battle, but the start of a transformation. Italian tankers climbed into their M1340 tanks as fascist soldiers. They came out of the war as witnesses to a better system, one that would shape Italy's future for generations. They had been shocked by Sherman tanks on the battlefield, but in the end, they were changed by what those Shermans represented. The amazing productive power of free people working in free markets, building a free society. That was the real weapon that defeated Italian armor, and that was the lesson that rebuilt Italy after fascism fell. The story shows a deep truth. Military technology reflects economic systems. The Sherman tank was better than the M1340, not because Americans were naturally better engineers, though American design was excellent. It was better because American democracy created conditions where innovation could grow, where mass production worked, where abundance was possible. Italian tankers learned this lesson the hardest way, through defeat, through captivity, through seeing the success of their enemy's system. But they learned it completely, and by learning it, they helped change Italy from a fascist dictatorship into a democratic republic, allied with the very nation whose tanks had destroyed theirs in the North African desert. The M1340 now sits in museums as a reminder of a failed system. The Sherman, though also retired, is remembered as a symbol of democratic industrial strength. But the real legacy is not in the tanks themselves. It is in the men who fought in them, who survived, who learned, who changed, and who built a better future from the ashes of defeat.